Do you believe that someone can literally disappear in the middle of a call with their parents without leaving any trace, sound, or even a sound of footsteps? Now imagine that on the other end of the line, parents are desperate, screaming for their child's name while the phone is still connected. But all they hear is silence. It's not a movie. It is not an urban legend. That happened. And to this day, no one has been able to explain how. The case you will see now has no happy ending. And it, also has no ending. It starts as an ordinary accident on a country road, but what happens in the next few minutes becomes one of the most unsettling mysteries ever recorded in the United States. This is one of those true horror stories that doesn't need made-up monsters, because the real terror is in the absence of an answer, in doubt that corrodes. It is in the emptiness that continues to scream, even years later. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old, an ordinary boy studying a clean and technical career, with friends, routine, close family. He wasn't the type to get into trouble, nor did he have a history of runaways or crises. That May night, he called his parents after suffering a minor accident. He was calm, he was lucid, he said exactly where he was. They were going to pick him up, only no one saw each other, no one found himself. And then he screamed. One word, a noise. And from that second on, Brandon ceased to exist. What you will see in this video is more than a simple case of disappearance. It is a rupture, a point where the real and the impossible touch, where the laws of logic, time, geolocation, and even physics seem to fail. This case involves inexplicable displacements, paths that lead nowhere, and a last connection that ends with a phrase that still echoes in the ear of those who listen to it. And no, this didn't happen in a dense Alaskan forest. This was not in an isolated village in Romania. This happened in the heart of the United States, in an open, flat area where visibility reaches for miles. And even so, no one could see Brandon. Not even he was able to see his own parents. They were within minutes of each other, on the phone, giving directions, describing posts, fences, roads. And even so, it was as if they were in different dimensions. This type of disappearance is not common. It carries a different signature. A load of strangeness, contradiction, and anguish that goes beyond the limits of a simple police case. That is why it has become the subject of debate among skeptics and spiritualists, researchers, and theorists of the unexplainable. Had Brandon fallen into a temporal hole, mistakenly crossed a boundary between worlds? Or was he a victim of something or someone who hides where logic does not reach? If you think you've seen it all in stories of disappearances, get ready. This case is on another level. He is in the territory of the inexplicable, and everything we know is recorded in calls, reports, testimonies, and a final silence that seems far more sinister than any scream. Because what scares here is not what was heard. This is what was not heard, which was not found, which doesn't make sense. You're about to dive into one of the most haunting and unsolved cases of recent times. But beware, this is not just a crime report. It's an experience, a journey through fear, doubt, and the possibility that there are forces, whether natural, supernatural, or psychological, that act when we least expect them. Forces that choose places and moments with almost cruel precision, and that sometimes leave no trail behind. Watch to the end, because by the end of this video, you might understand why so many people believe Brandon never got off the road, that he's still there, somewhere, but not in the place where we can see. Perhaps it is closer than we imagine, and if you're watching it alone, at night, in the dark, pay attention to the silence, because it was in silence that he disappeared, and it is in silence that this story lives on. Brandon Swanson was not just any boy. By the age of 19, he lived in Marshall, a sleepy Minnesota town known for its long plains, silent nights, and clear skies. He was an ordinary student, studying wind energy at a community college in Canby, a nearby small town, just 30 miles away. A route that he made almost every day, without mistakes, without detours. He knew every turn, every intersection, every landmark. It was like walking inside your own odd house. But that night, nothing was as it should be. It was May 13th, 2008, end of semester, party atmosphere. Brandon decided to visit two groups of friends in different cities. First, a party in Lind, then later he went to Canby. He had 2 beers at the first party and a glass of whiskey at the second, according to witnesses. Nothing that indicated an altered state of consciousness. Nothing that justified what was about to happen. He looked fine, lucid, sociable. At 1:30 a.m., he said goodbye and took the car to return home. A quiet, common return along a familiar route. At least, that's what everyone thought. But what no one knew at the time was that Brandon would never make it home. At 1:54 a.m., he called his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson. The voice was calm, but there was a slight discomfort. He said that the car had been stuck in a ditch on a rural road, that everything was fine, but I needed help to get out of there. No sign of panic, no urgency, just a simple cry for help. And then began a call that would become one of the scariest in American history. Brandon told his parents he was on the outskirts of Lind, about 13 miles from Marshall. His parents, in a mixture of concern and relief, quickly got dressed, got into the car, and began to look for the indicated place. Throughout the journey, they were on the phone with their son. He claimed to see Lind's lights in the distance. He gave details of the path, posts, fences. I'm here, turn on the headlights, and I'll see you. The parents did just that. They turned on the headlights, signaled. On the other end of the line, Brandon said he was doing the same, but no one could see each other. They were on the same road. The lights flashed. The voices were guided by the telephone, but it was as if they existed in two different worlds. This is the part that defies any logic. In a flat region with no mountains, where the headlights of a car can be seen from miles away, two people who were looking for each other with real-time coordinates simply could not find each other. Brandon began to get frustrated. He said that the parents had probably gotten lost. He hung up the phone in his mother's face. Minutes later, he called again. He said he was seeing the town of Lind. He decided to walk there. Let's meet in the parking lot of a party house, he suggested. Meanwhile, Brian returned home, left his wife, and went alone to Lind, calling his son again on the way. The call was resumed. Brandon remained calm. He described where he went: fences, fields, uneven ground. He said he was heading towards the city lights. They stayed like that for 47 minutes, talking, exchanging words of encouragement, updating positions. And then, the scream. A sudden cutting sound. Oh shit! And the line dropped. Nothing more. Brian tried to call him back, several times, but there was no response. The phone was still ringing, played, and it went to voicemail. The sign still existed. The phone was still active, but Brandon did not. From that moment on, it was as if he had evaporated from the planet. The searches began informally later that morning. Family, friends, acquaintances, all swept the roads around Lind, but there was no sign of Brandon, nor the car. Nothing. At 6:30 a.m., the parents called the police. And then one more disturbing detail. The police response was that Brandon was of legal age, a college student, and was probably just at a party or taking some time alone. Nothing out of the ordinary. The neglect was evident. The coldness, incomprehensible. It took a lot of insistence from the family for the official searches to begin. Precious hours had already been lost. At noon, the police finally decided to act. They triangulated the last cell phone signal. And then, the shock. Brandon was nowhere near Lind. In fact, it was more than 30 kilometers away, between the cities of Porter and Taunton. The car was found in a ditch, just as he had described. A green Chevrolet. Lumina in perfect condition. No signs of collision, no damage. No signs of struggle or presence of third parties. The engine was intact, but the cell phone and the keys had disappeared along with him. Near the car, sniffer dogs identified Brandon's scent. They followed a trail that led along a dirt road, then through a field and toward a river, the Yellow Medicine River. Once there, the dogs continued to track the smell for some time, even after the crossing. But then, the trail disappeared, as if he had simply ceased to exist on that other shore. This detail turned the case into something even more macabre. If Brandon had fallen into the river and drowned, the smell would not have continued. But the dogs identified that he crossed. He followed. He walked a little further. And then, he disappeared. This is not something that science can easily explain. Even in natural environments, humans leave traces, footprints, fragments, disturbances in vegetation, fabrics. But there was nothing, as if someone had drawn a line, and when crossing it, it had been erased. This sequence of events turned the Brandon Swanson case into one of the most studied, commented, and discussed disappearances in the United States. He did not run away. There was no reason. He was fine, with plans, communicative. He was minutes from home. He was with his parents on the phone, and yet disappeared. In the days that followed, searches increased. Helicopters, drones, horses, boats, nothing was spared. The whole community mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers. But all they found was that car. No backpack, no sneakers, not a hair. The phone was still ringing for a few hours, which indicates that the battery had not died. He didn't hang up. He didn't lose the signal. This means that for some time, Brandon was still alive, somewhere, maybe just a few meters from the help, but unattainable. Theorists began to emerge. Some said that Brandon had entered private property and had been killed by a farmer. Others believed that he fell into the river again, this time at a deeper point. But if that had happened, the body would have been found. The current was strong, yes, but not enough to carry everything without leaving a trace. Nor clothes, not even bones, not even a wallet. And then the darkest hypotheses emerged, the most unsettling, those that involve the possibility of a dimensional transition, of a flaw in reality, that Brandon, as he got out of the car that night, accidentally crossed an invisible boundary, something that separates our world on the other. An absurd theory? Perhaps. But the idea that a boy disappears in an open, rural area with full visibility a few meters from the help while talking on the phone is also absurd. The investigations continued for years. Perimeters were established, and calculations were made based on the average distance traveled on foot in 47 minutes. A radius of 5 kilometers was inspected dozens of times, until 2011 knew. Searches were carried out regularly. The dogs always led to the same point, the riverside. After that, nothing. As if Brandon had disappeared within the very logic of space-time. And the most devastating, the parents to this day keep the balcony light on, every night, waiting, feeding a last hope, because what happened on that call, it wasn't just a scream, it was a collapse, a tear, an opening to a kind of mystery that no investigation, no science, and no consolation can erase. And as strange as it may seem, many believe that Brandon never left, that he's still there, on a road we can't see, in a place we can't reach, but where, perhaps, he is still trying to light the lighthouse, and hoping that this time, someone will see him. As much as the facts seem clear in their chronology, an emergency call, a car found, a trail cut off, the Brandon Swanson case becomes, from here, a true puzzle that defies the limits of logic, criminal investigation, and even human perception. The line between what is possible and what seems impossible begins to blur in an unsettling way. And that's why, to this day, more than a decade later, his name still circulates in forums, videos, independent investigations, and documentaries as one of the most unexplained disappearances in American history. The theory most accepted by the authorities and part of the public is also the one that most irritates skeptics. Brandon would have drowned in the Yellow Medicine River. According to the sniffer dogs, he reached the banks of the river and, surprisingly, his trail continued on the other side, as if he had managed to cross on foot, perhaps through the rocks or through a shallower area. So far, everything makes sense. But no, because if he had really drowned there, the smell would have disappeared to the shores. And more than that, something would have appeared. Anything. A shoe, a wallet, a body, a sign of struggle, slipping, or even the remains of some personal item. Nothing was found. Nothing. In addition, his phone kept ringing for hours after the last contact. This contradicts the hypothesis of immediate submersion. A cell phone, even the most resistant at that time, would not survive running water for long without turning it off for good. This indicates that if he really fell into the river, it did not happen quickly. Maybe it didn't even happen. And that's when we start to dive into possibilities that escape the conventional. Let's imagine another scenario. A scenario where Brandon was not swallowed by the river. Imagine that he crossed, yes, as the dogs indicate, but ended up entering a private rural property. Can you visualize this? An unknown young man, walking at dawn, invading, even unintentionally, the land of an armed, frightened, perhaps paranoid farmer. The interior of the United States still holds areas where the law of man trumps the law of the state, and there are many documented cases where strangers have been killed for stepping in the wrong place at the wrong time. What if Brandon was mistaken for an invader? And if he tried to explain himself, but didn't have time? This gloomy hypothesis leads us to consider that perhaps someone felt threatened by his presence and decided to solve the problem in their own way. Then, afraid of punishment, he got rid of the body, buried somewhere inaccessible on the property, burnt, hidden under tons of rubble. In these regions, there are areas that have never been searched by the police, not because they didn't want to, but because the owners of the land prevented it. And without a warrant, without clear evidence of crime, the law does not allow force to enter. What if the key to the case lies precisely in these forbidden lands? Another theory circulating strongly on the internet is even more sinister, and for many more plausible than the previous one. Picture this. Brandon is lost, disoriented, walking for hours in the dark, alone, cold. He sees a car, a stranger, stops, offers help. Maybe he accepts, in innocence. Maybe you just want to ride to the nearest town. But what he doesn't know is that, on that road, at that time, he crossed paths with someone with bad intentions. A predator, a psychopath, someone who was never caught, because he never left any traces. If he really got into that car, then his track would be cut off there. The smell would be lost after the river, because the physical trail is over. He left the ground. He was taken. The cell phone was destroyed, thrown away, or kept silent until the battery died. The body, if it was killed, disposed of in another state. Or worse, he was never killed. He was never released. This theory chills, because not only is it possible, but it has happened to other victims, people who trusted the wrong person at the most fragile moment of their lives. But what if none of these hypotheses are true? What if we are looking for answers in places that do not even exist on the same plane? Yes, now let's talk about the theory that many reject, but few can completely ignore. The possibility that Brandon Swanson has disappeared between dimensions, or, to use the language of some theorists, to have crossed a crack in reality. Does it seem absurd? Then think again. Brandon accurately described places that did not exist in the place where he actually was. He claimed to be seeing Lind, but in fact, he was 30 kilometers away, in another direction. He flashed his headlights without being seen. He walked in a straight line, but never arrived. He spoke to his parents for 47 minutes, describing an impossible path. It was as if he were in an imperfect copy of the real world, walking along a parallel road, a failed replica of our reality, as if he were trapped in a reflection where cities are visible but unreachable. This idea, although it seems like the stuff of science fiction, has become increasingly debated among scholars of supernatural cases and real stories of unsolved disappearances. They call this spontaneous reality displacement, a phenomenon in which a person, for reasons still unknown, ends up crossing an invisible threshold, such as a gap, and enters a space where physical and spatial rules do not follow normal patterns. There, time may not run the same, space can be distorted, and the return may not be possible. Brandon was talking to his parents, interacted, but he was in a place where his parents couldn't see him, nor to reach it. Does this look like some kind of physical blockage, or with an overlapping of realities? This theory raises more questions than it answers. But as lunatic as it may seem, it echoes what many fathers, mothers, and loved ones feel after cases like this: that the person did not die, that she's somewhere, but in a place where we can't reach. Others argue that the error was actually human, that failures in the searches, resistance from farmers, errors in the interpretation of the dogs and the cell phone signal created a false sense of mystery, that he may have fallen into a hole, a grave, a dense area, and the body was never found due to sheer logistical limitation, that all of this may have been avoided more efficiently, with more commitment, with more urgency at the beginning. But this explanation, while logical, also seems cowardly, because it ignores the feeling of those who were there, from those who heard the last word, of those who know that something that morning simply didn't make sense. And now, I want to hear from you, but not only in the loose comments. I want you to tell me, where do you think Brandon is? Element. Write that. Just like that. Brandon is in, and completes with his theory, be it logical, emotional, absurd, or supernatural. Each comment is a way to keep this story alive, because maybe that's what we need to find an answer. What about you? What would you do if you received a call at 2 in the morning and the person on the other end of the line disappeared in the middle of the sentence? Think about it. Write, share, and get ready, because what comes next could change everything you think about Brandon Swanson's disappearance. And even with all these theories, with all the local media coverage, the organized search parties, the volunteers who walked miles and miles through the bush, mud, cold, and silence, no one came closer to the truth than in those early hours. Hours when Brandon's voice could still be heard. Hours when hope was still palpable. Because after that, all that was left was echo. An echo of something that seems to have never fully existed, as if Brandon had crossed an invisible border, a subtle limit between what we can explain and what simply escapes our understanding. Have you ever stopped to think about what it really means to disappear? Not in the figurative sense, but to really disappear, without leaving a trace. No documents, clothes, fingerprints, witnesses. This is not only rare, it is practically impossible, at least according to the laws that govern our reality. Still, that's exactly what happened to Brandon Swanson. He was there, in the flesh, talking about, walking, thinking, but after a certain second, it stopped being. And the most painful thing is that his parents heard this happen. They were on the phone. They heard the sound, the scream, the silence that followed. It was not an illusion. It was not something told by third parties. It was something lived in real time, a connection that was lost not because of a signal failure, but because of something much deeper, darker, something that still has no name today. And since then, every day, Brian and Annette Swanson turn on the light on their porch. They do it because they believe, or because they have to believe, that somewhere, Brandon still sees that light, that somehow he's still trying to come back. It may seem naive, it may seem irrational, but think, what would you do in their place? How to move on if your child simply vanished into thin air while you were talking to him? How can we find peace if there is no body, no object, no last sentence that makes sense? These are questions that haunt us, questions that, if you allow it, will live in some corner of your mind as well. Because Brandon's disappearance is not just the portrait of a tragedy, it is the portrait of a failure, a breach, a brutal reminder that we can't always control, predict, or understand what happens around us. There are real horror stories that confront us not with monsters, but with absolute emptiness. The kind of emptiness that screams louder than any presence, that consumes, devours, swallows without leaving any signs. And the most terrifying thing is that, at some point, this can happen to anyone. That's what turns this case into something much deeper than just a police mystery. It becomes almost a study about the limits of existence, about the fragility of human presence, about how sometimes reality just fault. Brandon could be me, it could be you, a root error, a misstep, a night too dark, and that's it. No one would ever hear his name again. But there is another dimension to this case that we cannot ignore. It is the official silence, the slowness of the police, the absence of answers, the initial negligence. Because if the search had started earlier, would anything have been different? It is impossible to know, but it's impossible not to wonder. And it is these questions that perpetuate the case, that feed entire online communities, that make thousands of people watch videos like this, looking for clues, signs, forgotten fragments. That's why Brandon Swanson's story never ends, because she is alive, in the memory of parents, in the 911 records, in the inconclusive reports, in the intact car abandoned in the ditch, in the camps that no one was allowed to enter, in untested hypotheses, and more importantly, it is alive in the silence that keeps calling, like a faint echo of a voice that still wants to be heard. And then I ask you now, looking directly at you, what do you believe happened to Brandon? Write in the comments, but he doesn't write just for the sake of writing. Choose your words, think about them, because, as absurd as it may seem, maybe some detail, some theory, some loose phrase here in the comments can illuminate something that no one has thought of yet. The story is open, she is alive, and maybe you can be a part of it. Start with, my theory is, or, if you want to go further, if I were Brandon, Let's bring the audience into the mystery. And while you think about it, try to imagine what goes through Brian's head every time he passes by the places where he was that morning. Or Annette, every time someone knocks on the door, and for a second she believes it might be him. Because when someone really disappears, what remains is not just mourning. It is the eternal, what if? What if he had waited in the car? What if the parents had chosen another route? What if the police had acted faster? What if the cell phone had sent one last location? And if all this has happened elsewhere? Yes. I know it sounds like too much, which may sound exaggerated, but that's precisely what makes the Brandon Swanson case so hypnotic, so disturbing. Because with each new attempt at logic, reality slips through our fingers, as if the case itself were a warning, a kind of riddle that is not solved with evidence, but with perception, and maybe, just maybe, with faith. And that's why we're here, talking about it. Because there is something about this disappearance that attracts us, that holds us, that forces us to try to understand. Because if we don't understand what happened to Brandon, then what else can happen without us noticing? Now answer me, sincerely. Do you think Brandon is still alive? Do you think he ran away, who was killed, or that it is on another plane? Which of these versions can you accept as real? Because no matter what your theory is, they all have one element in common. None can explain everything. And all this, it's exactly what scares us. Brandon's parents are still waiting. They continue to ask for help. They continue to live between absence and hope. They did not bury their son. They didn't find him, but they didn't give up either. And that's why the balcony light is still on, like a vigil, like a beacon for those who are lost. as a reminder that there are still unanswered questions. And maybe at this moment, as you listen to me on the other side of the screen, the sky outside is dark. Maybe you're alone, maybe with headphones, and maybe, just maybe, you can also hear this silence. The same silence that took Brandon away. They said they searched everything, every inch, every open field, every dirt road, every possible trace, but there was nothing. And when there's nothing, silence becomes evidence. The emptiness becomes a clue, and what remains are shattered memories sewn together by assumptions. Years passed. Grass grew where the car was found. The fences have changed. The owners of the land have changed. But the light on that balcony never went out. She remained there, every night. First of all, out of hope, then by insistence, and now perhaps by ritual. A weak, lonely beam flashing against the immensity of the unknown. In Brandon's room, nothing was moved. The posters are still glued to the wall, the notebooks piled up, the last used sneakers standing next to the bed. Everything remains as if he was going to return at any moment. As if, suddenly, that door opened. As if his parents could hear his footsteps climbing the stairs. As if time had frozen at the exact instant the call dropped. But time did not freeze. He passed. In a cruel, slow way, full of dates that make no sense. Birthdays, graduations, Christmases. Time dragged Brandon's absence like a shadow too heavy to carry. And yet, parents continue to wait. Because they have heard the last word. Because deep down, something in that connection still pulsates. It still calls. It still hurts. In 2015, someone said they had seen a young man with the same characteristics as Brandon in a country town. The police investigated. It wasn't him. In 2018, a radio program received an anonymous call with a similar voice. The recording was sent to the family. It wasn't him either. But what hurts most on these occasions is not the deception. It is the previous moment, the second before, confirmation, when everything seems possible again. And it is in this space between fear and hope, between the real and the impossible, that Brandon Swanson's story lives. Because even without a body, without resolution, without justice, she did not die. It breathes in every theory, in each post, in each video, in every balcony light that refuses to go out. And now that you know this story, what are you going to do with it? You can forget it. You can move on. You can press play on another video. But maybe, just maybe, some of it will stay with you. Like an echo, like that voice in the dark, like the sound of a broken call in the middle of an empty field. And if one day, while driving down an unfamiliar road, with no signal on your phone, with the sky covered with stars and the radio sizzling, you hear a voice whispering your name, remember, some disappearances aren't about where someone went. They are about what was left behind.